The paper that I did at this conference was on transnational politics in Ethiopia, trying to understand the relationship between diasporas, Ethiopian diasporas, particularly in North America, and politics back in Ethiopia, back in the homeland. I guess the way that I would pose the main question was to try to understand Ethiopian politics as being simultaneously a process, a single process, one part of which takes place outside of Ethiopia's territory, sovereign territory, its geographic space, and another part within the country. So there's a single political process that actors in different places bringing to bear different resources, engaging in debates, all focused on politics in Africa, in Ethiopia, but you don't need to be in Ethiopia to engage in those debates. So the example that I gave two examples in the paper. One is in 2005, there was an election in Ethiopia where the opposition was heavily involved with people in the diaspora. The debates went back and forth. There was a lot of money that was raised abroad. People from abroad, particularly from the United States, went back to campaign. And so to understand that election, you need to understand the kind of the political discussions, the nature of the actors, the kinds of processes that were both in Ethiopia and outside Ethiopia, and then the links between them, the way they became linked so that the political outcome of the 2005 election can be explained. The other case that I looked at is the case of debates or discussions around the war in the Ogaden, in the Somali-inhabited part of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government has tried to frame that conflict, has tried to explain that conflict as a case of either proxy war, that Eritrea and Somalia, Ethiopia's neighbors, are using the insurgents in the Ogaden National Liberation Front to attack Ethiopia, or that these people are terrorists. They're tied to terrorist networks in Somalia and in the Middle East. Diaspora people, Ogadenis, and who are in Stockholm and in Minneapolis and in other places, they are trying to come up with a way of a counter-narrative, another way for Americans and Europeans to understand what's happening in the Ogaden, and they emphasize that it's genocide, that it's crimes against humanity, that it's like Darfur, and therefore the international community should respond similarly. So I think that we see that the way that the Ethiopian opposition in 2005 saw advantages of working both in Ethiopia and outside Ethiopia, and how the conflict in the Ogaden is structured or framed, or international policy is shaped by actors both in Ethiopia and outside of Ethiopia, says that I can be a specialist in Ethiopian politics, but I don't have to look at Ethiopia. I can look at people in my own neighborhood in Northern Virginia and Washington, where I live and work. It's full of Ethiopians, and they are not observers of Ethiopian politics. They are actors in Ethiopian politics. They are part of a political process, and that's what's interesting to me, is how with globalization, faster, cheaper communications and transportation, that you can remain vital to your homeland politics even if you don't live in the homeland anymore. The next step, what I don't do, I talked about the diasporas that are in Washington, D.C. In fact, that's a very special, it's a very elite and very politicized group in the diaspora. The reason why they're in Washington is because they're political. In the Ethiopian politics, they became political refugees at a particular a point in time. Most Ethiopians are much closer, even if they're outside of Ethiopia. They're in Kenya, they're in the Gulf, they're in Sudan, and that's a very different type of diaspora. It tends not to be college-educated, English-speaking elite, but more often very poor, very marginalized people who fled because they could no longer make a living on the land. A very different population than the populations that I've studied. And so how does that matter? Where you are you near or are you far? Do you have access to the kind of the world of being somebody who blogs or puts out an internet newsletter versus somebody who is much closer, much more like most Ethiopians, living close to the land and surviving as best as they can, often by combining numerous jobs and relying on social networks and so on. My hunch, haven't done the research yet, is that I'd find a very different pattern. And so transnational politics has a very different, it plays out in different ways depending if the diaspora is in Washington or if the diaspora is in Kenya. And that is something I haven't quite figured out. Most diasporas don't come to North America or to Europe. They stay very close.